Episode 11.
Welcome to the Live Fit podcast with your host, Glenn Johnson. Today you will learn techniques for permanent weight loss and improved overall health.
Ah, yes, it's time again for the Live Fit podcast. This is episode 11. I am Glenn Johnson. Thank you all for listening. I'm really happy to have you here. Today I have an exciting show. I have New York Times best-selling author of the world-famous The Zone books, Dr. Barry Sears. He's been writing books about The Zone, titled The Zone, since 1995. Before we talk to him, I would like to give a shout-out to Mary W. She was kind enough to leave me a 5-star review on Stitcher Radio. She says, I really like the different topics Glenn touches on. I am interested in all things health, and I am loving all of his guests thus far. I like how he doesn't just talk about one area of fitness or focus on one ideology of health. It's great. So thank you, Mary. I really appreciate you taking the time to go to livefitlean.com/Stitcher. And now it's time for the answer to last week's question of the week. The question was, what does Mary take to fight a cold? Well, she gargles with colloidal silver about every hour. Then she takes a tincture consisting of astragalus, echinacea, and golden seal about 3 times a day. Then she makes a tea of elderberry, peppermint, and yarrow. She says that's really good for clearing congestion, the lungs, the sinuses, and that stuff. And she also sips on bone broth. Mary has a lot of information on her website, a lot more than what I just said about herbal remedies. I'm going to have another question at the end of this show. You'll be able to think on that, and I will give the answer on the following episode. Coming up in shows, I'm going to have an episode about sports nutrition. I also have a nutritionist who used to work for the Nestle Test Kitchen. She also was a juice bar franchise owner. And now it's time for my interview with the man whose book, The Zone, literally changed the direction of my career. Today I have on the line a New York Times best-selling author. He has written 13 books, sold more than 5 million copies in the United States. His books have been translated into 22 different languages. He's published 30 scientific articles and holds 13 patents. He has dedicated his research efforts over the past 30 years to the study of lipids and is an authority on the impact of diet on hormonal response, genetic expression, and inflammation. Some of his books are Mastering the Zone, Entering the Zone, The Inflammation Zone, The Anti-Aging Zone, and The Omega RX Zone. His most recent book is Toxic Fat, and he has another one in the works, which we'll talk about in a little bit. I am thrilled and overjoyed to have my guest today, Dr. Barry Sears. How are you doing, Dr. Sears?
Very good, thank you.
If you don't mind, I would like to gush for just a little bit and tell you why I'm so thrilled to have you on the show. It was in 97 I heard about your book, Entering the Zone, and I decided to read it and see what it was all about. I've never been a dieter, but I've always been interested in diets. I found it very fascinating that 1 month there's one diet that is the rage and everybody's talking about it. Then a few months later, another one comes on, and that other one was totally ditched. And so I was kind of interested in what makes this one different. Oh, this one's the next best thing. They got it a little bit wrong before. Now the next one's great. And so I've never been a dieter because I didn't need to worry about my weight, but I found it very fascinating. And so when your book came around, I read it, and I was really intrigued by the fact that one of the main things you said was that it stabilizes blood sugar, and you explained how blood sugar elevates and decreases, and that really sets us up for more problems, physiological problems and eating problems and things like that. And I've always been pretty sensitive to blood sugar. And so I started following The Zone, and I could not believe the effect that it had on my body and even my personality. Without those wild swings of glucose, I had a much more stable level of energy. I just felt regular, energized all day, not over energized, but not super sluggish or tired either. But also my temperament was more stable, because I found when I was really hungry, I'd get kind of crabby. When I was high on sugar, I'd be kind of manic. But this I found to be really great, and I've been eating that way ever since. And in fact, I've developed a couple weight management programs that I've been running for years now that use The Zone as the foundation of the program itself.
Well, I'm very, very happy to hear that, and very gratified, but not surprised.
So I want to find out, how did you write the zone? What was it that led you to coming up with this idea of the zone? I know you were a researcher, so you probably put some pieces together here and there, and then at one point you had a light bulb moment and went, aha. Am I right in guessing that?
Partially. You're quite right. My background is research, but not in nutrition. My research was really in drug delivery systems for cancer chemotherapy. Mm-hmm. And when you deal with cancer drugs, if you give too little of the cancer drug to the patient, they die. If you give too much of the drug to the cancer patient, they die of the cancer drug. So you're looking for a zone, a therapeutic zone. Mm. And where I became interested with the Nobel Prize being awarded in 1982 was the role of certain hormones called eicosanoids that control the inflammatory process. And my goal was not to put together a diet, but really a way of life to control inflammation. And the reason being that everyone in my male side of my family had died prematurely of heart disease. My father, who was in the Basketball Hall of Fame, had died in his early 50s of heart disease, as did his brothers, as did my grandfather. So I knew I carried the same gene for a premature death from heart disease, but I could possibly change that outcome if I could control the levels of inflammation. And actually, the zone started out really with using fish oils as a primary tool of controlling inflammation, but I was finding there's this too much inconsistency. So I went back to the bowels of the MIT library and found the answer. You had to control insulin at the same time if you want to control inflammation. And that led me to develop the Zone diet, not as a weight loss program, but going back to the root of the word diet from the ancient Greek, means way of life. And what's the Zone diet? It's a way of life of controlling inflammation for a lifetime. And what's your payoff? You live longer, you live better.
Yeah, you feel a lot better. I can definitely attest to that. I mean, it was really a difference of a very, very obvious, noticeable difference from eating a plate of pasta and how I felt immediately and for the next several hours after that versus eating a Zone meal. Huge, huge difference. Now, in your book, you do mention that food is essentially a drug. Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, in many ways, that's a very derogatory statement because food is more powerful than any drugs because food affects hormonal responses. And hormones are hundreds of times more powerful than drugs. So it means that every time you eat, you're causing hormonal changes which are vastly more powerful than any drug can possibly anticipate. And yet your ability to control the outcome is totally dependent on how well you balance your plate. And that's a very powerful statement because it allows you to basically go in and to rechange, really re-alter your genetic future. Because it's how our hormones, how they can be orchestrated, that can change the levels of inflammation, and that can change the expression of our genes. Which means, and ultimately, that diet becomes the same level of gene therapy. Don't like the genes you're born with? That's okay. You can change their expression if you treat your diet like a drug, if you take it the right dosage at the right time for the rest of your life.
Wow. That's pretty awesome. I know a lot of people. I had Dr. Edward Abramson, and he talked about emotional eating, and I know a lot of people eat for emotional reasons. And in fact, he said about 70% of men do for emotional reasons. And one thing, I probably got it from your book back in 97, I've been teaching people to treat food as fuel because, and I give the analogy of a car. If you want to drive a car, you need to put gas in the tank before you can go anywhere. You can't wait till you get there and then fuel up. And it also has to be the right kind of fuel. So that really harkens really well with me. But I'm wondering, when you say treat food as a drug, would that be all macronutrients, or are we just talking about carbohydrates? Or
Oh no, all macronutrients, because they all do different things, hormonally speaking. And that's why you have to look at the balance of protein, carbohydrate, and fat. And people say, oh my God, that's so hard. I can't do it. Get off my back. It's not that hard at all. All you need is 3 items: 1 hand, 1 eye, and 1 watch. So here's how you balance your meals to get the right hormonal response for the rest of your life. At each meal, simply divide your plate into 3 equal sections. On 1/3 of the plate, you put some low-fat protein that's no bigger or thicker than the palm of your hand. The other 2/3 of the plate, You fill it until it's overflowing with colorful carbohydrates. Those are called fruits and vegetables.
Mm-hmm.
They're colorful because they contain chemicals known as polyphenols, and those polyphenols are also very powerful anti-inflammatory agents. And finally, you add a dash of fat. What's that? A small amount. But just make sure the fat is rich in monounsaturated fats and low in omega-6 and low in saturated fats. Which fats meet those criteria? Either olive oil or guacamole.
Oh.
And why do you need the watch? Because if you balanced your plate correctly, for the next 5 hours, you will not be hungry. You're not hungry because your blood sugar levels are being controlled, and you're maintaining peak mental acuity. So if you have those 3 items, following the zone diet for a lifetime is incredibly simple.
Well, that does sound pretty easy. Like you said, a lot of people say this is so hard, it's confusing, and I've used that rule of hand before too. But I think you simplified it even easier than that. So you mentioned carbohydrates, and you definitely mentioned fruits and vegetables, and I'm sure you're quite aware that there's this big anti-wheat trend going on right now. How do you feel about wheat and grains?
Well, I had a quote in Time magazine in 1997. And I think the quote was said, if all bread was taken off the face of the planet, mankind would be better off. It wasn't because wheat is the evil villain. It's just that bread has a very, very high glycemic load. It raises blood sugar levels rapidly. That brings out the hormone insulin, and basically it drops it down blood sugar levels quickly. So you're looking for those to have a more moderating effect on blood sugar. Now, we've been told that, gluten is the cause of all of our problems. But if you look closely into the data, it just doesn't match up. If you are truly gluten insensitive or basically gluten intolerant, and my wife is, that means you have celiac disease, mm-hmm. Yes, you simply cannot eat gluten. So I know exactly the problems of those who have a genetic deficiency or genetic propensity for gluten intolerance. Now, what about the people who say, well, I stop eating bread and I feel better? Say, well, of course you feel better. Why? You're not putting as much sugar in the body by taking the bread out of the diet. People don't realize that bread is basically, in many ways, a veilingly disguised, gigantic sugar cube. Mm. Actually, bread enters your bloodstream as sugar, as glucose, faster than table sugar does.
Really?
And therefore, the more you put bread on your plate, especially white bread, the more you're going to see this rise and fall of sugar levels, and you go through this emotional and hormonal yo-yo day in and day out.
Well, that's pretty profound. Since I've been hearing about the anti-wheat thing, and I've been testing myself with it over the past year, and trying to eat as little as possible, and even going a week or two without any wheat of any kind. And I've definitely noticed a little bit more stable energy, but the main thing I've noticed is the lack of cravings for baked goods and sweeter carbohydrates.
Well, and because what you're doing, you're hopefully replacing that source of carbohydrates with fruits and vegetables.
Yeah.
And as a consequence, they basically moderate the glycemic load in the diet, and therefore you help moderate the levels of carbohydrates in the bloodstream. But that's why you also need protein. That's why it has to be balanced off by protein. These two work like a check and balance system. So that's why you basically put a little protein on your plate and a lot of colorful carbohydrates, and your watch is going to tell you how well you're controlling your hormones for those next 5 hours.
Great. And you said a little bit of fat, just a dash of fat on your plate. And if I remember right, you recommend 30% of your calories should come from fat.
That turns out to be a dash.
Oh, okay.
And because the thing about the zone diet is that you're never hungry. And if you're never hungry because you're stabilizing blood sugar levels, you don't eat as many calories. See, people thought the zone diet was saying, well, that's one of these high protein diets. Saying, no, every dietitian in the world recommends eating no more protein than you can fit on the palm of your hand. I concur. And everyone says you should eat lots of fruits and vegetables. I concur. So with the zone diet, you had the zone paradox. You're eating a lot of food, but you are not eating a lot of calories. On the zone diet, you're eating about the same amount of protein that Americans have been eating over the last century. But your number of calories coming from carbohydrates are decreased because it's hard to overconsume broccoli.
I've tried.
It's easy to overconsume pasta and pieces of bread, but trying to eat 12 cups of steamed broccoli, it's hard work.
It is. I speak from experience. I love broccoli, and I'll often eat just a giant pot of steamed broccoli, and I've yet to become fat from doing that, even late at night. Now,
and now we go back to the amount of fat. We're talking about maybe 50 grams of fat per day. That's well below the recommendations of the American Heart Association of a low-fat diet.
Now, you have a book called Toxic Fat. Would you like to talk about that a little bit since we're on the subject?
Well, people have so many misconceptions of what causes obesity. That's why we have 15,000 diet books in press. What we really have, obesity is not so much basically a course of people being morally deficit, but basically it's a case of inflammation. The inflammation starts in your fat cells and then begins to spread like a cancer to other organs. And that spread is through a particular fatty acid known as arachidonic acid. I just shorten that to be called toxic fat. Because the high levels, arachidonic acid will kill. How does it kill? It increases inflammation. And that's the driving force of virtually every chronic disease. Heart disease, diabetes, cancer, Alzheimer's, you name it, they're all ultimately inflammatory diseases. And as you had that toxic fat coursing through your bloodstreams, you're doing everything possible to speed up and accelerate the development of chronic diseases. The zone diet was developed to keep arachidonic acid under control.
Do you think the zone is appropriate for everybody?
Yes, from ages 2 to 102.
Okay. That's pretty much everybody.
Well, by the time you get to 102, whatever you're doing, you keep on doing it. It's working.
Yeah. Yeah. If you've made it that far, it doesn't matter if you're having.
But I say that because the hormonal responses are relatively invariant in humans. These responses have not changed in 40 million years, and they won't change tomorrow.
The interesting thing is I've been recommending this way of eating for, pretty much since I discovered it myself. And I find clients now and then, I'm a personal trainer as well, and I find clients come up to me and they say they're having problems, they're losing weight and this and that, and I ask them about their eating. And when they describe their eating, I find that they're not eating in the zone. And I ask them about it, and they just sort of like, I don't know. And it seems that people get bored of it, and they want to try something new, or they slip back into their old high carbohydrate habits. I have one client who just loves pasta, and she has pretty much an impossible time eliminating pasta from her diet. Do you have any recommendations I can say for people like that?
A couple. One is that, when we first started working with the zone diet, though I developed it for treating cardiovascular and diabetic patients, I did most of my initial work with world-class athletes. They, too, are totally dependent on their hormones being in the zone. And the athletes I've worked with have won 25 gold medals in the last 5 Olympics.
Wow.
They had a hormonal advantage over their competitors. And so if you're looking, that's what you want in life. You want a hormonal advantage. Mm-hmm. If you control your hormones, you compete better. You basically lose fat. It's not losing weight, it's losing fat.
Right.
And that's a slow process. And basically you live longer. So you pick and choose what's important to you today. And then say, okay, how do I basically look better or live longer or perform better? Saying they're all one and the same. And people say, are you telling me that the diet you recommend to a overweight type 2 diabetic is exactly the diet you recommend to a world-class athlete? Well, the answer is yes, except for one small difference. The world-class athlete needs more protein, so need more carbohydrate and more fat.
But it's all in proportion.
It's all in proportion. And the Olympic athletes I have worked with who won the 25 gold medals, none of those athletes ever consumed more than 2,500 calories per day.
Really?
Why? Because they're able to basically, when you're in that zone, you're able to convert dietary calories into chemical energy. It's called ATP more effectively. And that's why we eat. We eat not to get calories, but to convert them into chemical energy so we can survive and move around. The zone diet just speeds up the efficiency of the process.
Now, would you recommend an endurance athlete who is out for a long time? Like, for example, I like to ride my bike long distance. Would you recommend that I eat in the zone while I'm on my ride?
Of course. Let's say that you're an endurance athlete. Let's say you compete in the Ironman at Kona.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty long distance.
It is.
Now, it's very hard to eat when you're swimming, right?
Yeah.
It's pretty hard to eat when you're running.
Yeah.
But you've got 6 hours on the bike, you can eat all day long.
True.
And so basically we just stock their water bottles up of our Ironman athletes with basically mixtures that are balanced in protein, carbohydrate, and fat to fuel them through the race. So now when they enter the marathon, the last part of the race, they're ready to go.
Does it matter the protein source? Like, would you select whey for somebody to do that?
No, actually, you really want a mixture of proteins. Whey is a fast-acting protein. Casein is a slower-acting protein. So by balancing whey and casein, i.e. milk, you're able to get a better hormonal flux of protein, and that stabilization helps you out dramatically as an athlete.
Huh. Well, that's...
One of my best athletes is one of the world's greatest ultramarathon runners. His name is Dean Karnaces.
Right.
And Dean basically runs, usually 100-mile marathons or 200-mile marathons. And he wins all the time because his body is adapted for what is called metabolic flexibility. He can switch from burning carbohydrates and fat very effectively where athletes who eat a high carbohydrate diet can't. Mm-hmm. So he has a dramatic hormonal advantage against them.
Yeah, I read his book, and it starts off with him eating a pizza while running down the street in the middle of the night.
And again, now those are basically getting energies, but again, during his non-training, he adheres to the zone very carefully just to maintain that metabolic flexibility so he can switch back and forth during the course of a long race, getting high calories, but again, the metabolic machinery basically is able to convert them more effectively into ATP.
Now, I know your system is 40% carbohydrates, and there's a lot of people getting into the paleo or paleo-ish type eating. Now, they're from what I can ascertain from what I know about it is they're probably eating more like 20 or less % carbohydrates. How do you feel about that?
Well, first of all, they're not paleo. The start of the zone diet came from an article written in 1985 in the New England Journal of Medicine by the founder of Paleolithic nutrition, Boyd Eaton. And the most recent article of academics in studying this area have tried to ascertain what was the balance of protein, carbohydrate, and fat, to our best knowledge, eaten by Paleolithic man. And their extensive analysis came out to be about 40% carbohydrates, 30% protein, 30% fat. Uh-huh. Well, maybe I just made a lucky guess. but when something goes up in your diet, something else has to go down.
Right.
So as you push down carbohydrates, usually you push up fat.
Right.
Saying, okay, fine, if the fat is all olive oil, but usually it's saturated fat, the porterhouse steaks and stuff like this, or the coconut oil. But these contain saturated fats that can turn on the inflammatory responses. So what you're looking for is that sweet spot. That sweet spot you can stick with that gives you the best hormonal results. And so far, the data has been pretty clear scientifically that balanced ratio of proteins, carbohydrates, and fats basically seems to do the best.
Now, I know they're also talking about the types of fats, and they, at least the ones I've read and listened to, say that the saturated fat and cholesterol in eggs and beef and coconut are not harmful to you. How do you feel?
Well, again, they seem to ignore the medical literature. And so this is what happens. The first casualty of diet books is the truth, usually. So it's saying that, yes, I can rank fatty acids accordingly in terms of their inflammatory potential. The fatty acids that have the greatest inflammatory potential are omega-6 fatty acids. These are now the most inexpensive sources of calories on the face of the earth. Less inflammatory, but still inflammatory, are saturated fats. Non-inflammatory are monounsaturated fats, things like olive oil. And then you get into the real powerhouses, the anti-inflammatory omega-3 fats. So if you're an athlete and you're basically causing inflammation by your exercise, do you want to decrease that inflammation by eating omega-3 fats, or to increase that inflammation by eating saturated fats and omega-6 fats?
Well, I definitely want to increase or decrease the inflammation. So
Right.
But omega-3s are pretty hard to come by.
And so that's why that, but the data is quite clear when you basically compare diets rich in monounsaturated fats to diets rich in saturated fats. The diets are in monounsaturated fats are far less inflammatory.
So what's new with you? What's either on the horizon or what have you done recently?
Well, what I've been doing recently is doing just two things in my spare time: raising the dead and curing the blind.
Really? Tell me more.
Well, it's not quite raising the dead, but it's pretty close to it. I spend a lot of time now these days working with severe brain trauma patients. My first one was with, I remember if you believe you remember the Sago mine disaster about 7 years ago?
No, I'm not familiar with that.
This was when 13 miners were trapped in a coal mine explosion.
Oh, yes.
And only one was brought out alive, and just barely. When they brought him out, he had heart failure, kidney failure, liver failure, and brain failure.
Wow.
Basically, the 41 hours of exposure to carbon monoxide had destroyed virtually all the white matter in the brain. So that night, I got a phone call from his neurosurgeon who had read my book, The Omega RX Zone, and said, because he had just gotten a call from the governor of West Virginia saying, this man cannot die. So his next phone call was to me saying, what are we going to do about this? So we air-shipped down a lot of omega-3 fatty acids and started really almost force-feeding him with the omega-3 fatty acids through his feeding tube. And 2 months after that, he came out of his coma, kept feeding the high levels of omega-3 fatty acids. These are about 15 grams a day of omega-3 fatty acids.
Right.
And 2 months after that, he went home. His heart was normal. His kidney was normal. His liver was normal. And he gave a speech worthy of any Italian politician.
Really?
Now, that could have been just a lucky break, but we've done it now 7 times.
Holy cow.
And so that in the area of severe brain trauma, this may be the only really hope to basically for a patient. Because when you have severe brain trauma, what you have is inflammation in the brain. Mm-hmm. And unless you put out the fire, you can't rebuild the brain. And so, again, in terms of severe brain trauma, we've been doing a lot of work. And then you get to the more mild brain trauma, like concussions in NFL players. Those are easy to treat. Now, in terms of basically curing the blind, again, a little poetic license, but there is a condition we work with. It's called macular degeneration. Mm-hmm. And this is the primary cause of blindness after age 50. It's really of inflammation of the retina. And there's no known medical treatment. If once you get macular degeneration, you will be blind in 10 years. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. So we've been basically doing, we just published this work recently, of giving high-dose fish oil to these patients with macular degeneration. And what you find, within a matter of months, usually about 4 to 6 months max, their sight returns.
No kidding.
And because what you've done, you put out the fire. And by putting out the fire in the retina, you're able to basically now to allow the cells to regenerate.
Well, for the layperson, what's the best source of omega-3s? Should we just get it all from food, or is there supplements that you would recommend?
Well, the trouble of getting of all food, for the omega-3s, we're really talking about the long-chain omega-3s, which means fish. Unfortunately, all fish in the world today are contaminated. Contaminated toxins we've thrown into the environment in the last 2 generations. You can run, but you can't hide. So the alternative to get adequate levels of purified fish oil is to go now to purified omega-3 supplements. Unfortunately, you're not going to find these in health food stores or the supermarket. This is what separates the men from the boys in omega-3 fatty acids, your ability to get rid of toxins, especially things called PCBs. These are polychlorinated biphenyls.
Right.
And, now once you remove them and able to concentrate the fatty acids, now you have weapons-grade fish oil. And that weapons-grade fish oil allows you to go to much higher levels to get now a therapeutic dose to give therapeutic responses. And so that's why once you have access to this kind of weapons-grade fish oil, it becomes really a medical miracle. Why? It puts out the inflammatory fires. And that is really basically the underlying cause of virtually all chronic disease, whether it be obesity, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, neurological diseases. They're all just different manifestations of inflammation. And if you control inflammation, you control the future of medicine. And that's where I started 30 years ago, when the Nobel Prize in Medicine was awarded for understanding how certain hormones, they're called eicosanoids, control the inflammatory process. And I realized at that point to say, I could apply all of my background in cancer drug delivery to treat food like a drug to control inflammation. And if I was successful, you would cut the Gordian knot of chronic disease.
That's compelling. But where can I get weapons grade omega-3?
Well, there's really only probably two spots. One, you can go to your doctor and basically get a prescription of drug. It's called Lavazza. It's good quality oil, but you will only get it if you basically have high triglycerides. The other source, I don't want to sound too touting here, would be our website at zonediet.com. Actually, in terms of PCBs, our levels of PCBs are actually lower than Lavazza.
Really? That's fantastic. Did you also tell me that you have a new book coming out?
New book, and this book is called The Mediterranean Zone. The book really basically deals with the last leg of the stool of dietary intervention. We have the zone diet,
right?
We have the omega-3 fatty acids, and now we have dramatically new information on these strange chemicals that give fruits and vegetables their color. They're called polyphenols. At low levels, they're very, very good antioxidants. At higher levels, they are very, very powerful anti-inflammatories. At still higher levels, they basically are powerful anti-aging entities. What they do, they turn on what's called the enzyme of life. This is the enzyme that basically recycles your ATP that allow you to basically have peak of performance with the least number of calories. And so these polyphenols become an integral part of our health. And why? Because as humans, we're only partially human. We have 10 trillion human cells in our body. We have 100 trillion bacteria in our body.
Wow.
So we're really a walking hybrid of bacteria and human cells. And what the polyphenols do in high concentrations is to control those 100 trillion bacteria in our body to reduce the inflammatory load on our poor 10 trillion human cells.
Wow. I can't wait to read it. When's it coming out?
This will be coming out in September of this year.
Okay. I'm going to pick up a copy of that and your the omega-3 RX Zone too. I haven't read that one either. I read Entering the Zone and Mastering the Zone in some of the cookbooks. So I have some reading to do after this. I'm going to put links to all of your books on the show notes page, your website. Do you have anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up? I have one last question for you.
Well, I think that that people are more confused today than ever about diet. We make medicine more complex than it really is. We try to make diet more simple than it really is. What I've tried to do over 30 years is say it is complex, but there's some basic rules that aren't too hard to follow that can allow you to see the changes in really a matter of days. You from your own experience. Once you begin to change the balance of protein to carbohydrates, saying, "Oh my God, I feel better," and explaining why you feel better is the role of science. And that's what again, nutrition is complex science, and when we try to dumb it down too much, we end up basically wiping out all the credibility of really what we should be doing to live a longer and better life.
Well, I think the way you describe the zone as being pretty simplistic. I think it's pretty simple, pretty easy to follow, and it can be done at home. It can be done in restaurants or parties as long as the three different core macronutrients are available. I think it is pretty easy.
Call me crazy. I believe you. I concur. So I scratch my head all the time saying, "Oh, the zone is really good, but it's so hard." I say, "Come on, give me a break."
Yeah, watch this. I can tell you in 1 minute how easy it is, or less. Well, I certainly thank you for being on the show. I have one last question for you, and that's what motivates you to stay fit and healthy?
Well, obviously, one thing, living longer. And it's not, no one wants to live to be 120, but what you want to do is squeeze all you can out of your life. And so you really have a tripartite aspect of how to do that. One, you have to eat correctly. Mm-hmm. That's your foundation. Two, you have to exercise. And it has to be basically a comprehensive exercise program. You need strength training, you need endurance training, and the best one is usually interval training, and you need stretching. And finally, and here's the hardest part, you need some downtime. You have to find a comfortable chair every night and sit in it, and for 20 minutes try to think of nothing.
Wow.
And why? That builds the brain up like a muscle.
So you
It
mean
builds up basically to increase your awareness of the things you have to do if you want to live longer and live better.
so you don't mean sit in this chair and watch TV or read a book?
Now you turn out the lights and basically close your eyes and try to think of nothing, and it's very hard work.
Sounds like meditation to me.
It sure is. It's worked for about 4,000 years, but you just got to do it.
So eat in the zone, exercise a variety of activities, high and low intensity, and meditate on a daily basis.
It works for me.
That's your secret to longevity and good health.
Still here.
What kind of exercising do you do?
Well, I do, basically I do both interval, endurance training. Basically, really I've been rower down my garage. That's my gym. And then on the days I don't do my interval training with the rowing machine, then I do weight training, but a lot of eccentric exercising. That is basically, pull the weight up and then lower it very slowly against gravity.
Huh.
Gravity is your greatest ally. Work with it.
Interesting. Yeah, I haven't heard too many people doing eccentric exercises on purpose in quite a while. So that's interesting. I'm going to have to do a little more experimenting on that. I used to back in the 90s when it was kind of a mini rage, but maybe I'll try it again.
Well, and that nice thing about it, basically, because you have to use lower weights, it's a lot more difficult to hurt yourself.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
And at my age, that's a very important thing.
It is important, and that's one of the main factors that a lot of my clients come to me with is they want to get more fit and healthy and stronger, but they don't want to injure themselves or become injured. And so that's on the forefront of my mind. And there's always this fine little balance of working them enough to give them enough stress to improve without giving them so much stress that they become injured.
Sounds like a zone to me.
It does sound like a zone. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Sears. I can't tell you how much this means to me. I've really enjoyed talking to you. I think my listeners will really get a lot of good information out of this. Just the last tidbit you said right there about your recipe for longevity and good health while you're getting to that endpoint, I think is going to be worth the expense of listening to this free podcast anyways. They just have to put in 35 minutes or so to listen to the end.
Well, I thank you very much for the opportunity of being on your podcast.
Well, you're welcome. You have a great day and hope to hear from you again soon. I'll be reading your book when it comes out.
Thank you very much.
Wow, that was awesome, wasn't it? Thank you again, Dr. Sears. I really enjoyed having you on my show. I appreciated you taking the time to answer all of my questions. Like I said, I've been a fan of yours since 1997. I'm sure a lot of my listeners are really appreciative to hear you answer these questions as well, even if they weren't a fan of yours before. Maybe you've got some new fans right now. I'm going to have complete show notes on my website. You can find links to his books that he's written and some other information on livefitlean.com. Also, please go to livefitlean.com/iTunes to leave a review of the show. Now, I want to give you next week's question of the week. Which burns more calories, walking 3 miles or running 3 miles? I'm going to have the answer to that and much, much more on next week's show with my guest, Carolyn Day. Thanks for listening to the Live Fit podcast, and as always, live fit.